The allegations of what he said at school, I think, are more complicated. The Nigel Farage line is basically the Christopher Marlowe defence. When one of his characters was accused of a terrible crime, he said, well, it wasn't another country, and besides, the wench is dead.
It is potentially relevant to ask these questions about a future Prime Minister.
In cold black and white, it looks as though I made Cecil Rhodes seem like Jeremy Corbyn. Even if you take away the allegations against Farage himself, there's a persistent view amongst some that populist politicians who raise these issues are basically one step from Hitler. Hello and welcome to Quite Right. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer at The Spectator.
And this week we'll be looking at reform. Has the party plateaued, and is Nigel now in a tailspin? We'll also be considering the NHS, how it treats women, and what both our report into the state of maternity services and also an employment tribunal in Scotland tell us about how women are treated by our most important public service. And we'll be considering two new shows that have been on the airwaves this week: Liz Truss's foray into current affairs television and Meghan's Christmas special.
It's fair to say it's been an interesting week for Reform UK, in between questions about potential election overspending, questions about things that Nigel Farage may or may not have said when he was a schoolboy at Dulwich College in the 70s, and the defection of Scottish peer Lord Offord from the Conservative Party. Be really interested, Michael, to hear your take on this. Is there perhaps a sense now that Reform have peaked and that things are going in a different direction for them, or are they as unstoppable as they always seem to be?
I think Reform had an amazingly good summer. I think it was one of the things that we remarked on in an earlier episode, that the launch pad that the great local election results that they had gave them meant that there was a huge amount of interest in them. And everything from the fact that they were going to launch the Doge equivalent for local government to the successful way in which Nigel Farage over the summer essentially controlled the headlines, particularly on migration, but overall drove things. Then through to conference season, the defection of Danny Kruger, the fact that Nigel Farage was mentioned constantly in Ed Davies' speech, that he was the subject in particular of Keir Starmer's sort of fight back, all of that made him the central figure in politics. But conference season also marked Kemi Badenoch's comeback, as it were. And since then, it's been more difficult for Nigel Farage to present himself as the alternative to the government and the coming man. He's fought hard. He's a formidable campaigner. And the defection of Malcolm Offord, and I'm sure we'll touch on it in just a sec, it shows that he has a continuing capacity to twist the narrative to his agenda. But he has come under fire. Both the recent allegations about election spending, which I think will probably, just wash through. But the broader conversation about what he said and did as a schoolboy has had a durability amongst commentators that must be discomforting for him.
There are claims that as a pupil at Dulwich College in the 1970s, that Nigel Farage was a bully and said anti-Semitic things to Jewish students. And there may be other claims that I've forgotten about, but these seem to be the main ones, right? I think it is potentially relevant to ask these questions about a future Prime Minister. At the same time, many of those who are most up in arms about this, I think, have really forfeited their right to be up in arms about anything. If you ask British Jews, I suspect they would say that they're much more worried about the clear evidence of two-tier policing and about the accommodation of people with Hamas sympathies in the justice system. And the BBC, for example, has been completely compromised on this. And then even, for example, this latest question about did they overspend at the last general election in Mr. Farage's seat? A government that is literally cancelling elections does not get to jump on its high horse about this stuff. And so I feel a bit like there is this, it has the feeling of a concerted effort in some quarters. I can understand why Farage's opponents would want to do that, because until now there had been a feeling that he was so good at controlling the narrative and, as you say, he completely dominated the summer. And perhaps there's a feeling that if he's having to answer questions about this, he's not able to transmit the kind of messages that he wants to. But I can see that it might also weirdly strengthen him.
Yeah, I think it does amongst his his core supporters, because it feeds a particular narrative. That the person who has complained about election expenses is a disaffected member who was ejected from the party for all sorts of misdemeanors, apparently involving all sorts of unseemly items that he kept stored in his drawer. More broadly, the allegations from school days will be viewed by his supporters as recycled material, which comes from decades ago, which is being dredged up by the media, the uniparty, the establishment, in order to destabilise this insurgent threat that Farage poses to their comfortable complacency. I think that the election spending allegations, as you say, who knows what Essex police will find, probably won't damage him, because I think that there was a sense that at the time that he was fighting Clacton, everyone believes now that he would have won that anyway. Yes. And more to the point, everyone recognises that Reform got as many votes as the Lib Dems, if not more, but only, 4 or 5 seats. So therefore, it's not as though there was some grotesque democratic steal going on.
Yes.
The allegations of what he said at school, I think, are more complicated. Now, the Nigel Farage line is basically the Christopher Marlowe defence. When one of his characters was accused of a terrible crime, he said, well, it wasn't another country, and besides, the wench is dead. His view is that the past is another country, and, who's going to be worried about what a 17-year-old said at school? But some of those making these allegations clearly believe that there is a line connecting the schoolboy Farage to the contemporary Farage. And they think that this wasn't just the mischief-making of a playground maverick, but this is the deep-buried bullying prejudice of someone with a nasty streak in them. My view, for what it's worth, is that he still deserves the benefit of the doubt, because none of us, including myself, would want to be judged on what we said or did before we were 18.
I think it sets a sort of quite a worrying precedent if every public figure is potentially going to have their entire life, including before they were an adult, dredged up at any time. I
hope not analogous, but there is a relationship. When I was an undergraduate, I took part in all sorts of university debates, and some of those debates were the earnest and mock serious debates, but attempts to be serious debates that undergraduates have on issues of high principle. Some of them, those debates, were intended to amuse and provoke fellow students. Some of what I said in those debates was dredged up by The Independent, in which I praised the British Empire in terms that were intended to be, at the very least, tongue-in-cheek. In coal black and white, it looks as though I made Cecil Rhodes seem like Jeremy Corbyn. But they were comments which, if you saw them in context, you might not necessarily have thought were either amusing or tasteful, but you would have seen that they were designed to be part of an entertainment. I wasn't there. We weren't there. The people who were on the receiving end of these insults feel hurt by them.
Yes.
But it's also the case that 40 or 50 years on, they're being raised in a way which is intended to damage Farage politically.
And I think people can see that too.
Exactly.
Yes.
So my view is, yes, he may well have been, a bit of a, pain, to put it mildly, as a schoolboy. I'm not sure he would have been my first choice of mate on the back of the school bus in whom to confide. However, it seems to me that you have to judge him now on the policies that he's put forward and the positions that he's put forward, and you can take exception to them, but he's been very clear that Reform is drawing a clear, bright line between its policies on migration and those, for example, of Tommy Robinson. And he's been very clear that there is a form of agitation on migration and on questions of race and integration that he wants to go nowhere near. And his principal lieutenant, Zia Youssef, is a practicing Muslim, and Nigel has been very clear that that should be respected. So on that basis, I think that we should give him the benefit of the doubt. And I think there's something else here as well, which is, even if you take away the allegations against Farage himself, there's a persistent view amongst some that populist politicians who raise these issues are basically one step from Hitler. And therefore, if you can somehow make that most toxic of connections, you can ensure that that individual is somehow not just ushered out of polite society, but effectively silenced. And that's why, and again, I wasn't there, I don't know what he said at the time, that's why I think that people can make their own mind up about Nigel Farage's views on the basis of what he says now and what he advocates now, not the misdemeanors for which he was responsible as a kid.
Also, just that Nigel Farage, I think sometimes we're liable to forget this because Reform UK is such a new electoral force. But
yes.
Nigel Farage has been at the forefront of British politics for such a long time, longer than, frankly, any of the other people, any of his major opponents at the moment, much longer than Kemi Badenoch, much longer than Starmer, even Corbyn, who's obviously been in politics for ages, but only came to the fore in the mid-2010s. I feel he's kind of a known quantity in politics. And this has been, such things may have been baked into people's impressions of him. And so by peddling this narrative, which I have seen in some corners of the mainstream media, that this basically is game up for Nigel Farage. It just plays into this sense that there's a bit of a stitch-up going on here.
Yes, I think that's correct. And my general feeling had been that for those inclined to vote reform, and those who are currently voting reform, these sorts of allegations are of a piece with the allegations that were flung at Trump as well.
Exactly.
And that they say more about the accusers than they do about the person being attacked. And that in those circumstances, the energy of the attack can sometimes actually be a strength for the individual concerned. Because, as Trump said, they're not really going for me, they're only going for me because I stand in front of you. And in that sense, there'll be some people who will think that these attacks on Farage are attempts to delegitimise the concerns that he's expressed that they share.
Yeah. I think the more pertinent question, because you mentioned earlier about how you feel that the Conservative Party has had a bit of a turnaround, which is somewhat reflected in the polls, but Conservative Party is still massively flagging behind Reform UK. It's just that I think Labour are doing so badly themselves that the Tories now look rather better by comparison. But I think one of the reasons for that slight resurgence, if maybe that's not overstating it, is the budget, where the Conservatives mounted a very spirited rebuttal of Rachel Reeves, and they were arguing on specific policy position. There's also been a much more effective Tory attack unit that has been at the heart of some of the resignations that we've seen. They've been pushing the message very strongly and all of that jazz. I think that if the economy deteriorates to such an extent that the next general election is fought on the economy, the Conservatives have a greater chance. If, however, it's fought on the trajectory of immigration, which is also highly likely, they don't have a hope in hell.
Yeah, I think that the attacks on Farage, again, relate, of course, to the suggestion that somehow there is a wicked racist streak behind the concerns that he's expressed on migration. I think that's a reflection of the fact that if the debate is around migration, then he's in his element, and he's the person who, as you quite correctly pointed out, has been in public life for 20 years, has raised these concerns consistently.
Longer than 20 years, yes.
And whom people will believe is a sincere tribune of their feelings on this matter. And notwithstanding the case that Kemi Badenoch or Chris Philp or Robert Jenrick might make, some people will argue that it was Farage who'd been the voice crying in the wilderness who now deserves his vindication. But I agree with you that if the nature of the debate switches to the economy, then the Conservatives are in a stronger position. And while Farage has had to deal with these allegations, and again, his handling of them hasn't been quite as adroit as it might have been, it's clear that that reveals a sort of certain vulnerability, not perhaps on the substance, but certainly in terms of a thinness of skin, perhaps, on his part when faced with something that is personal criticism. That suggests that in difficult economic times, when you need the steadiness of hand on the tiller, and also you need that grasp of detail, that maybe, just maybe, the good old, bad old Tories are the wiser option. And the budget plays into that, because as you've remarked in the past, it's not just that it provided Kemi Badenoch with an opportunity to rip Rachel Reeves apart. It also reminded people that when it comes to welfare, and the party most likely to reduce welfare spending and reduce state spending overall, the Tories are in a sweet spot compared to both Labour, obviously, but also Reform, whose position on welfare has been far less well defined.
Yeah, and I'm kind of always interested to know how much traction stories that we discuss are getting, not just with people who are very interested and animated about politics, but with people who are apolitical. They will turn up and vote, but they're not necessarily following back and forth. I mean, important stories, like, for example, the Nathan Gill, the was it Reform's leader in Wales, who was literally in the pay of Russia. I mean, that is a massive story. I also wonder how much that has gained traction, how much people are aware of it. And if they were aware of it, whether they might say, oh, it's a bad apple, but we still feel that Nigel Farage is more on our side than any of the other crop of politicians we've had recently.
Yeah, I think that the view that most people have of Reform is shaped primarily by Nigel Farage. And this guy, Nathan Gill, who'd been a UKIP MEP and then a Brexit Party MEP and then had been briefly in Reform, I think, and who was associated at one remove from Farage, was in receipt of Russian cash. He was guilty of treason. And it reflects badly on him and his associates. And Labour have tried to weaponise that again, and other critics of Farage, by saying, oh, well, Farage is soft and Putin and all the rest of it. Again, I think there's a sliver of something there in that Farage has expressed a view on the Russia-Ukraine war that is slightly more sceptical, slightly less enthusiastic in support of Zelensky than the position of either the Conservatives or Labour. But while I disagree with that scepticism towards our support for Ukraine, nevertheless, it is a leap to say that he's a secret Putin lover or Putin's friend. Again, the same allegation was directed at Trump. It backfired. And I think that those hoping that Nathan Gill's conviction for receiving Russian cash will somehow taint Farage, I think are making the wish the father to the thought. And that the overall sense that the country has of Farage, that you mentioned earlier, I think is pretty strong. And the question will be that people know both the strength of his convictions, but also some of the, not fragility, but some of the weaknesses of character, the fact that he finds it difficult sometimes to be an effective team player. They might judge that adversely. So that, of course, the ability to be a team player now comes very sharply into focus because his success in securing new defections, mainly and principally from the Conservatives, Danny Kruger, and now Malcolm Offord, Lord Offord, someone with whom I used to work in government, Tory peer, former minister, that, on the one hand, reflects well on Farage, that he's attracting talent. On the other, it creates this key test. Can he lead if not a team of rivals, certainly a team of talents, in a way that makes him a credible alternative prime minister? Because, again, I think it's the case that for most voters, when you choose a prime minister, you're also choosing them on their ability to have around them a strong team. And it was certainly the case, I think, that when David Cameron was bidding for power in the 2010 general election, the fact that he had William Hague and George Osborne by his side, I think, added to that sense that young Lochinvar had around him both wise heads and young talent. And that, I think, will be a test.
I think that Reform UK have the great advantage of being neither of the two main parties right now, and this gives them, without a record that they have to be atoning for or taking ownership of, they can present in many different ways to many different people. Where I can see problems arising is if it does continue to be that one-man band. For example, they have talked about how they might use the Lords to appoint ministers, ministerial candidates. Much will depend on the level of talent that they can attract to their ranks for the next general election. And I think that partly hinges on whether it can be fully and definitively established that they are now the main party of the right, and therefore they will cannibalise what's left of the Conservative Party, and any talented person of a conservative or right-leaning disposition will therefore be more attracted to them. So I think it's still up in the air as to whether that will happen. So that's a kind of question mark. I could foresee a situation where they have an awful lot of backbenchers who haven't got anything to do.
Yes.
And they're appointing everyone from the Lords. That could be seen as a bit of an insult or a snub. And we've already seen how in Keir Starmer's ranks, having a vast number of MPs footloose and fancy-free and without even a Potemkin PPS job or bag-carrying job to keep them busy have got upset, and there have been rebellions, and they've been spectacularly bad at managing those tensions. So I foresee problems for reform, but some of these problems may necessarily not expose themselves until they're actually in office.
Nigel Farage, if he's going to have a majority, will need more than 300 MPs. At the moment, he's got a handful. He will need, as you pointed out, and as he said himself, to have new appointees in the House of Lords to act as ministers, even if they're not cabinet ministers,
yes,
in order to be accountable there. He will need, he's made it explicit, people to be special advisors, to replace the heads of a variety of arm's-length bodies in order to make sure that they're aligned with what the government wants. He'll need a team of at least 500 talented people in order to give effect to the change he wants. Because he's not coming in simply to administer the British state. He's coming in, he says, to utterly transform it.
Yes.
Now, it's been tough, I think, for any mainstream political party to get 500 people of talent and ability to run the risks that being in public life inevitably brings. If there are reason listeners out there who are up for joining Nigel's 500, joining him in the pass of Thermopylae in order to beat back the woke army, let us know. We would love to hear from those people who think that he can make a difference and a contribution. And who knows, if you let us know, we might let Nigel know. After the break, we'll be looking at the NHS and at two particular cases that reveal the ways in which the NHS is arguably letting women down. This week, there have been two parallel reports that raised troubling questions about the NHS. Baroness Amos, Valerie Amos, has produced an interim report into the state of maternity care in the NHS, in which she says that she's shocked at the failures to deal effectively with women at one of the most vulnerable and important points in their lives. And it's also the case in Scotland that we've had the result of an employment tribunal where Sandy Peggie, who was a nurse who had complained about the presence of a biological male presenting as a woman in the lavatories of her workplace, that employment tribunal has actually found, notwithstanding what the Supreme Court says about women's rights, women's only spaces, and trans men and women, that actually it was acceptable for that biological male to be in a space that Sandy Peggie would have considered to be women only. Now, very different cases, Maddie, but I think they both reflect, I think, a failure, an institutional failure to appreciate not just the feelings of women, but the safety of women.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that a country that truly valued women and valued motherhood would not allow maternity care to be the absolute disgrace that it is. And the Sandy Peggie ruling is quite worrying to me, because although her appeal has been partially upheld from what I can tell, it's still a fairly curious judgment, because it still seeks to reach some kind of accommodation between a woman's right to undress with privacy and dignity and the right of an employee with the protected characteristic of living as a different gender not to be discriminated against. So Sandy Peggie, her claims weren't fully upheld, and I'm no lawyer, but this seems to me a curious reading of a Supreme Court judgment which was absolutely definitive on this. And I think it really reiterates the fact that although the Supreme Court has spoken, there needs to be much more firm guidance coming from government about how that should be interpreted by different government departments and public bodies, because there still seems to be an element of confusion. I'm sure, by the way, that Sandy Peggie there will be further legal action after this, but it seems to me slightly inconclusive in comparison with what the Supreme Court ruled, which was,
Let's turn to Sandy Peggie in a moment. I just wanted to touch again on the question of maternity care. From the experience of friends and family, do Baroness Amos's concerns resonate with what you've heard? Absolutely.
It's something that I think for many women, I would include myself in this, you you don't think too much about maternity care until it comes near the time where you think about starting a family or actively trying to start a family, and then you look into it, and all of a sudden you find often quite shocking results. As with many areas of healthcare, it seems to be a complete postcode lottery. There are some geographical areas of the country, in particular trusts, that do a really good job, and others where it's mixed, and others where it's lamentable. And I actually don't think that these reports are revealing anything particularly new. It's been a kind of open secret, and there are particular hospitals which have a really appalling track record. I've been looking into this. If I were to have a child, the nearest hospital for me would be the John Radcliffe in Oxford. Absolutely terrible for maternity care. And I've heard some shocking stories from people I know who've given birth there, including one person who gave birth. It's very common practice in some hospitals to basically usher out the dad after the mother has given birth. So someone who's had a caesarean birth and is left holding the baby and can't even ring for pain relief because their husbands have been sent away, and they can't even reach the button because they're holding a newborn baby, having just had a caesarean. I mean, this is the level of kind of inhumanity that women are often putting up with. And another really shocking stat that I heard actually Wes Streeting used recently, that we're paying out more in clinical negligence for maternity failures than we are spending on maternity care itself. I mean, in a very crowded field of state dysfunction, I think this has to be near the top.
My own children are now in their 20s, so my own experience as a father obviously is from some time ago. However, what I observed at the time and what I've heard from others since leads me to believe that there's still an enduring problem, one that Baroness Amos has highlighted as particularly concerning and if not deteriorating. And part of it is that the very close personal attention that someone requires at one of the most important moments in their lives and at a moment of vulnerability is often not there, because you will have a sense that the individual concerned is as much an encumbrance or as much part of a machine which has to process a set number of interventions as a cherishable individual. Way back when Jeremy Hunt was Health Secretary, one of the things that he continually sought to focus on was the importance of patient care, the way in which the NHS overall had seemed to be taken over by a culture which was mechanical rather than humane, which was process-oriented rather than genuinely invested in the unique needs of the individual at that time. And everything from the administration of pain relief to the continued presence of a trusted figure by your side at that critical moment, it's not being provided.
No. Often women who are perhaps hoping to have a home birth,
yes,
they deal with different people all the time, and they really hope that they will have maybe one of a few midwives, let's say, that they have been dealing with, and then they find that on the day no one can predict when you're going to go into labour. They have a completely unknown person because
Precisely.
Things are very stretched. And it's not, this is not to blame midwives. I think very often they're in a very impossible position where they are overloaded and they're having to do the job that perhaps they need another third again added to their team for it to be functional. But you often find someone you've never dealt with at all dealing with that most special but also scary and painful time, especially if it's your first birth. I've noticed more and more people wishing either to have a caesarean because there's a sense that is a known quantity and you're safe with a caesarean, even though actually many people take a very long time to recover from caesarean birth, but they see it as safer than the kind of lottery of a natural birth. I don't know if that's the right word. I don't want to insult anyone, but let's say natural birth or birth with an epidural or something, just because they see it as a safer way out.
Yes, and I think that it's also the case that there are, as is the case in so many areas of medicine, there are different schools, both within the practice of medicine, but also in some of those who are concerned from, the NCT and others about what the ideal is. This is an area where I fear to tread to proffer an opinion, because my own view is that what really matters is what the mother herself believes is important. So if it is the case that the mother herself knows that the right thing is an appropriate level of pain relief, that the natural birth arguments, however persuasive they might be in the abstract, don't really do justice to what someone's body is going to go through at that critical point. The important thing is building care around the individual. And again, in this sort of gap between the NHS's machine and the debate over what the best model of childbirth should be, it is often the case that the experience of the woman, particularly as you point out, the very first time that they're giving birth, is overlooked.
I mean, with so many of the people I know, I'm just struck by the radically different experiences that people can have. There seems to be no rhyme nor reason to it. For every person who had a positive experience, there will be a harrowing nightmare. And I do think in some cases it may put women off having children at all, because the stories can just be so shocking and involve long-term medical consequences for the mother. And often trauma at the time of the birth can lead to difficulty bonding with the baby.
No, exactly.
And a really difficult first few months of their newborn's life.
West Street, of course, is responsible for the NHS in England, not in Scotland. And it's in Scotland where the Sandy Peggie case occurred. A very different set of issues here, but also one where I think that there's been an insensitivity to the specific feelings of individual women. Because, again, you or I can have different views about the trans question. I don't think we do have very different views, but still we can have different views about the trans question.
We completely agree.
But the key thing is, it's not for me as a man, and it's certainly not, I think, for a tribunal to say to women in a women-only space, get over yourself because someone who was born a biological male is in there. It just seems to me that an employment tribunal is the wrong place to have these issues rehearsed. And this employment tribunal certainly seems to be operating in the absence of effective guidance, following on from a Supreme Court judgment that applies across the whole UK.
And it's just yet another example of how, as with so many things, the onus falls on women. Individual women have to go and assert their rights in this way, with all the toll that it takes on you to bring this kind of action, the stress, and also how what a strange feeling it must be for a nurse working in Fife to suddenly become, the centre of such attention. And she does this not just no, of course not. And she does this not just for her own rights, but she ends up safeguarding the rights of other women. I mean, it's heroic, but it shouldn't always fall on women like Sandy Peggie to maintain the rights of all women ever. The case itself actually makes me so angry even thinking about it. I cannot believe that we have a situation where there's a nurse who, after a long shift, she's sort of premenopausal and suddenly begins menstruating. So she goes to the women's changing rooms, where she finds a biologically male doctor getting changed in the room. And she says to the doctor, this makes me feel uncomfortable. And the biologically male doctor then complains, and the hospital trust finds her guilty of gross misconduct, and she is suspended. I mean, obviously this predates the Supreme Court judgment, but it's astonishing. And of course, there are many such cases. The Darlington nurses have brought a similar case, and that will be concluding sometime early next year. But it's of a piece, and you know what? There is a class element to this. It's not the contested spaces are often not the places where middle class progressive activists will be using. It's NHS nurses. It's prisons. It's very easy for people to focus on hurt feelings and not the very real consequences of ignoring biological realities.
I think that class point is underappreciated. I think that in particular, some of the hardcore trans activists thought in particular that when it came to men in women's prisons, that people wouldn't care what happened in prison. And I think it's particularly malicious of some of the ideologues. There'll be individuals with their own challenges and their own choices about how they want to live, who deserve consideration and respect. But the idea that you should get behind the cause of disturbing the sanctity of women's spaces and think that because those women, either because they're in prison or because they're working class nurses, won't have the wherewithal to challenge it, that's wicked. This week, we've had 2 new shows from 2 women whose, I think, presence is perhaps not necessarily the most soothing and relaxing at Christmas time. And that, of course, is Liz Truss, who started her own new show, and Meghan Markle. And Meghan is back on Netflix with the latest iteration in her series, With Love, Meghan, Holiday Celebration. Maddie, which of these 2 would you least like to be compelled to watch?
Well, I have watched With Love, Meghan and the Christmas special, and I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think people are making a mistake with the Sussexes, just generally to take them far too seriously, more than they deserve. I think they should be seen in the canon of inadvertently highly amusing minor royalty, in the same way that Georgian audiences were amused by William IV, future William IV, then just one of many princes, and his famously pineapple-shaped head. It brought great delight, and there are many other examples through British history. But for me, the premise of these shows is so fundamentally preposterous that in some ways it's kind of jumped the shark.
Yes.
And now we just get to enjoy it as a form of kind of almost performance art.
Yeah, I think we'll touch on Liz Truss in a second when it comes
Which
to performance art.
I haven't seen, by the way. I think only you have seen Liz Truss's show.
I set aside many hours to watch and rewatch the Liz show. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think you're absolutely right about the Meghan phenomenon. There was a period when we were encouraged to believe that Harry and Meghan's adventures in California were somehow a threat to the monarchy. And that Harry's book Spare was somehow a dagger pointed at the heart of the royal family. My own sense is yours, which is the king and the Prince of Wales can look after themselves, and that Harry and Meghan have made a choice, which is to become entertainers. And in that sense, they fulfill a function exactly as you described, which was fulfilled by any number of princes at some distance from the throne throughout history, or princesses some distance from the throne throughout history, which is innocent amusement.
Yes.
And the innocent amusement derives, I think, from the earnestness with which Meghan presents herself as somehow the Athena of domestic goddesses.
Well, I think what you say is very true. Initially, I think they had the potential to cause lasting damage to the royal family, but being Harry and Meghan, they have no ability to restrain themselves, and they ended up overplaying their hand and annoying just about everybody. They're now really unpopular in America as well. There is something about overplaying that hand and perhaps far too much self-pity and victimhood, 2 qualities that no one really finds attractive. But there's also this absolutely, one of the great sources of comic potential for me in Meghan's various shows is the kind of weird faux relatability that she does. Mm. The show has a real Potemkin quality because it's not her house. It's a set. But she kind of pretends that she's hosting people, but it's in someone else's house, and it's all done with great at great expense. But there are occasional attempts to be relatable and down to earth. So there's a bit when she talks about this kind of lavish display of like a obviously very expensive tea set, and she points at this mug, and she's like, "Oh, you could get this at the flea market." And it's like, narrator, they did not get this at the flea market. There's a wonderful moment where she teaches someone how to build a arch made of balloons for a children's birthday party. And she says to her friend, who, by the way, is not a real friend, it's a Potemkin friend, who's an actress that I wasn't really aware of. Do you go all out for your kids' parties? And the friend does not get the memo about the kind of Le Petit Trianon vibe that we're going for here. And she just says, yes, the woman I hire does. I
think she was the woman who was hired in order to be Meghan's friend for the moment.
Oh, yeah, she was 100% hired. But it's just amazing. She didn't get the memo, so she inadvertently gives the game away. There's also a moment in that episode where she says to Meghan, she makes the mistake of calling her Meghan Markle rather than Sussex, and she kind of low-key loses the plot in a slightly Norman Bates way. There's kind of like crazy eyes, and she's like, I'm Sussex now.
Well, this is the curious thing, that one of the personalities that she chooses to present is that of the strong and liberated woman who's made her own career in Hollywood. And yet, the extent to which she trades on her husband's name, association with the royal family, and also the domestic goddessery is all about being the perfect homemaker. So it's curious that on the one hand, she wants to have a domestic goddess cake as the lovable mumsy, and on the other hand, she wants to eat it in order to be seen as the ball-breaking power woman who makes Hillary Clinton, seem like Mavis Riley. And in that sense, the tension, I hesitate to use the word tension because that implies a degree of drama, but the gulf between the different personalities that she's trying to project mean that she, it ends up seeming all fake, fake as the food, as fake as the salads, as fake as the tree decorations. And there is, I think, a sort of ghastly, compelling horror for the first sort of 5, 10 or 15 minutes of any With Love Meghan episode. But after that, it's painful to watch because...
I think I must have a much higher tolerance for this than you. I find it all hilarious from start to finish.
I suspect it's not. Yeah, I think you're right. It is tolerance. Because it's not earnestness on my part. There's all sorts of schlock I'm happy to watch. It's just that I think, what is the point? Already we've plumbed the depths of counterfeit emotion and fake domesticity, and there is nothing more. And you get a greater sense of insight into family dynamics through watching Terry and June reruns.
Oh, 100%.
Than this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's just also the other thing that really makes me laugh that I do think is kind of relevant for, at least for an English audience, is the level of like sort of California progressive woo-woo language that creeps in.
Yes.
And every sort of insufferable maxim that you can imagine, she will say. So, for example, in the Christmas special, she tries to make everything really kind of meaningful, even if it's just a simple Christmas chore. So, for example, a Christmas tree is a way to encapsulate your family story. Christmas crackers are a way to do something really fun and intentional before a family meal. It's like, mate, it's a cracker, come on. Why is it intentional? Like, yes, I intended to open this cracker. What the hell are you talking about? And decorating biscuits is a meditative moment. Like, all of this... I just find that the attempt to turn even the most basic household activity that the rest of us just quietly do and don't overthink.
When I dunk my chocolate digestive into a cup of tea, this is more than a meditative moment. This is when worlds come together, Maddie. As we see the digestive melting into the Darjeeling, what we're seeing is our own lives and our own souls commingling into something that is neither solid nor liquid.
It's a liminal moment.
It is. and the colloid that is created is, I think, symbolic of the way in which heat brings to the fragmentary and yet the sweet something new. And in a way, that's true of our relationship.
Tell me you did a humanities degree without telling me that you did a humanities degree.
But the other... TV moment, and I know that you didn't watch it, and I'm not going to recommend that you did this week, was Liz Truss's new show. And Liz Truss's new show also has Liz, a bit like Prince Harry, as a figure once loved, now reviled in Britain, reinventing themselves with the help of American support. It is an American platform, and in it, to be fair to Liz, she remains feistily defiant about the reasons for her departure from office. And she has guests who agree broadly with Liz's worldview, replaying back to her what her overall sentiment is. All I will say is that if you're the sort of person who's a Liz fan, you'll like it. And if you're not, you won't.
Has Liz Truss jumped the shark in the same way that Meghan has?
Not quite yet. Again, to be fair, It is a relatively conventional format with Liz, much in the manner that Fox News pioneered, doing a sort of monologue right at the beginning in which she outlines, her views, Sean Hannity or even Tucker Carlson style, though her views are not quite Sean's or indeed Tucker's. And then she has three guests. And the guests are people who, it's not a journey of intellectual exploration. It's got the feel of one of the oldie-style party election broadcasts where Tony Benn would be interviewing Hugh Gateskill or Harold Wilson, and the Tony Benn figure would say, socialism is very much the wave of the future. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Gateskill? And here you have Liz saying, the deep state is a real threat, isn't it, to the way in which British people want to see their country run, Matt Goodwin. And Matt looks on and probably thinks, how big is the cheque? And then nods appropriately and says, yes, you're absolutely right, Liz, and then runs through some of the points from his blog.
There's a really good bit of I think it might be Harold Macmillan puts out an election broadcast in the 1950s where I think it's before the election where they win by a large margin. So is that 57?
Yes, 59.
59, okay, sorry. 1959. He basically has the equivalent of like an episode of Loose Women, but it's with members of his cabinet. So it's like, they all get introduced in that Pathé real voice, and it's like, Mr. Heathcote Amory and Lord Hailsham. And Harold Macmillan just talks to them. He's like, I thought we should talk about how well things are going, don't you? And they all agree with each other. And it's almost like one of those Harry and Paul sketches, only it's real, like, women, know your limits. I'm here for it.
This probably says more about me than it does about Liz's programme. I would happily watch a succession of party election broadcasts from the 1950s in preference to Liz's show. But again, you pay your money, or rather you don't, it's on YouTube, and you take your choice. But for me, the model of political communication will always be Clement Attlee, who at the end of an interview was asked by the interviewer in 1950, is there anything more you'd like to add, Prime Minister? And he said, no, I don't think so. I think that sometimes less is more. I don't know whether or not that lesson should apply to me, or to Liz, or to Meghan. But I wish Liz and Meghan and Harry and Nigel Farage a very happy Christmas.